Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Since October 7th, the world has felt different for a lot of American Jews. Antisemitism has risen. More recently, 2 people were shot dead outside a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C. And a man with a flamethrower in Colorado attacked Israeli hostage advocates. At the same time, the Jewish majority country that is Israel has continued its attacks against Hamas in Gaza. On Sunday, 13 Palestinians were killed and over 150 injured after Israeli troops and American contractors opened fire on crowds waiting for food near 2 aid distribution sites in Gaza. Israel's months-long food aid blockade has put 1 in 5 Palestinians on the brink of starvation. There are now 57,000 Palestinians who've been killed by Israel's attacks since October 7th of 2023. Where has this left Jewish Americans? What does it look like to hold a range of difficult, sometimes opposing views on a topic that's often a lightning rod in American culture? Julian Levinson is a professor of American Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan, and he's worked in his classes to get students, often young Jews, to be containers of multiple perspectives. He spoke with producer Sam Corey last week about how to be open to difficult information and what makes it possible for people to change their mind.
There's a lot happening for American Jews right now. There's certainly a lot happening with Israel. And of course, there's a rise in anti-Semitism. What are the challenges that American Jews are facing today? And how do they look different than the 60s, 70s, 80s?
Right now, we are reeling after 2 attacks, very violent public attacks on Jews, just in public.
Yeah, of course, you're talking about the 2 staff members from the Israeli embassy who were shot dead outside of a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C., and a man with a makeshift flamethrower who was yelling "Free Palestine" and hurled a device at a group raising attention for Israeli hostages in Gaza. He had injured 8 people.
And in D.C., these people turned out to be staffers for the Israeli embassy, but that was not known by the attackers, so far as I can tell. It was done, they were killed in a Jewish museum, not in the Israeli embassy. So they were targeted as Jews. One of them, it turns out, was not Jewish, but they were certainly targeted and killed by somebody who wanted to kill Jews, who, as far as I can tell, he didn't distinguish between Zionists.
I think this is hard for people to understand, the differences between anti-Zionism or being critical of Israel and being anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. Can you pull those apart, what those differences are as you understand them?
Sure. Zionism is a political movement with a specific history, very similar to other nationalist movements that we know throughout the world. So it's a the word Zion is the biblical word for Jerusalem. But Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism. Let's say that. Okay, the idea that Jews are a nation and, like other nations, should have a home, a state, a land where they can live, and they have a culture. Then anti-Semitism is opposition to Jews. So you can say it makes much more sense to talk about Jews who are anti-Zionist than Jews who are anti-Semitic.
How does Israel and the idea of Israel relate or tie to American Jewish identity today? And how is that different than, say, 3 decades ago?
Well, it's become increasingly divisive. Let's put it that way. It's become more, it always was divisive, but there were periods where it seemed there was a kind of a kind of emerging consensus that American Jews feel some degree of loyalty to the state of Israel. That emerged after World War II. Well, the state was formed in 1948. So gradually through the post-war period, this increased. The key turning point there was the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, the lead up to which created a lot of anxiety for Jews around the world. Was this going to be, was Israel going to be pushed into the sea, et cetera? So 1967 was a great turning point. That's also, of course, when the West Bank and Gaza were occupied. So that's sort of the most recent origin point for the mess that we're in now. From that point on, there's been increased loyalty among some sectors of American Jews and also increased resistance.
Pull that apart
opposition.
for me. Who's doing the resisting and who's more loyal?
The moment of the Six-Day War was also the time of the Vietnam War. And resistance to the Vietnam War was buttressed by an overall worldview, which was an anti-colonialist worldview, which was suspicious of superpowers from, over the sea, meddling in the affairs across oceans. So opposition to American involvement in Vietnam translated into opposition to American support of Israel and Israel's place in the Middle East in general. So the birth of today's version of anti-Zionism is the 1967 war. And in America, on the left, there was an interesting kind of division at that point. Young Jews were in the New Left. Some of them looked and noticed that their non-Jewish friends in the New Left were all of a sudden anti-Israel, and that made them turn away from the left. Some. Others understood the critique of Vietnam as applying in many ways to Israel as
because
well.
Israel's also seen as a settler colonial state and particularly occupying Palestinians.
Exactly, particularly as the occupation developed and grew.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm producer Sam Corey speaking with Julian Levinson. He's a professor of American Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan. We're discussing how his students and Jewish Americans are reacting to incidents of anti-Semitism and how they're grappling with Israel's continued war with Hamas. There seems to be a generational divide in terms of how American Jews view Israel. And it seems that younger people are much more likely to be critical of Israel rather than older American Jews specifically. I'm wondering if you understand that to be true, and if you understand that to be true after October 7th, if you've seen that true in American culture.
Yes, I have. I have seen that. That is true by and large.
Why do you think that is?
General.
What do you think is the cause of that?
Young people are more idealistic. They think in moral absolutes a little bit more. Maybe it's even evolutionary. But it's certainly the case that when you see bombs falling on civilian population, you respond. The graphic images that people have on their phones have been unbearable. And the young people are responding to that.
What are the conversations like in your classrooms when Israel and Israel's bombardments come up? Are students outraged? Are they defending Israel, particularly from the American Jewish students? What kinds of things are they expressing?
Oh, a variety of things. Sometimes people are feeling under attack by fellow students who who can be very vocal in their anti-Zionism. And so the Jewish student feels, understandably, under attack and assault. And then how do you respond to that? Well, you try to protect yourself. You try to come up with some kind of argument about why the person attacking you is misguided. It's a kind of self-protective response. I'm
wondering how you create conversations that try to open things up, maybe that try to hold a range of perspectives when your students deeply disagree. What do you do to try to create a setting? I'm glad you asked me that, because it gives me an opportunity to say the class that I feel went the best in this regard. I'm very interested in Yiddish and the Yiddish language and Yiddish literature, and there's a wonderful website called In Geweb, which is sort of the center of Yiddish literary
culture today, and it has lots of translations. And the editors went and found all these poems that had been written in Yiddish today. So contemporary Yiddish writers, people who know Yiddish, write poems, post them on Facebook, online journals, and they collected all of these poems. And some were very strongly Zionistic, responding with horror to the attack on October 7th and calling even seemingly for revenge. But these were poems, so they were emotional outbursts. Others were horrified at the Israeli military response. Others were just sort of pacifist in between. So it was a whole spectrum of political views, but they were poems. One of the poets objected to being in the same anthology with another poet because of political views. So I brought all these ideas to the students in the debate. And they debated not Zionism pro or con, but they debated whether they should include this poem or that poem. What is the role of culture? What is the role of literature at a moment of political military crisis? So it turned into questions about free speech and human expression and what is art. So that's kind of once removed, you see.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what kinds of conclusions did students have if they had them?
In that context, people tend to say, let's let everybody express their opinion. There tends to be an openness to hearing the experience of people. If it's a first-person account, I feel this. Here is why I feel it. Here is who my mother is. Here is who my father is. Here is people are very willing to listen to that. Once it gets grandiose and ideological, people revert to positions that they have already established and that they're trying to rehearse again.
And this is super interesting. In this vein, have you seen students change their minds, in particular about something as charged as Israel and Israel's actions? Have you watched, based on the context that students are in, them either become more critical or more supportive of the country?
I've seen people who may have identified more strongly as a Zionist come into a classroom reading first-person poem. There is a very beautiful poem that was translated into Yiddish as well as many other languages around the world, written by a Palestinian poet who was killed in the war. Very moving poem. And, people were crying in class because it was a direct human expression, right? I teach literature and poetry. I don't teach politics directly. So I have faith in the first person, in accounts. So those tend to be more effective, I've found.
What I'm kind of picking up from you is that it's so much better than to debate whether a side is right or wrong. It seems like in having conversations, better to give people space to express things through poetry, through art, and to sort of let that breathe and to reflect on that and to try to get people to reflect on positions that maybe they don't see very often. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I love to teach memoir. I love to teach autobiographies where sensitive writers are grappling with the confusions that they're dealing with, the mystery. I mean, that's one of the things that we all share, and we all don't fully understand ourselves. I mean, we tend to look for commonality in things that we all believe, but how about look for commonality in our ignorance of ourselves? You know what I mean? In other words, the best poems don't resolve questions. A professor who I admire very much said, a poem is a stay against confusion. As in, in a trial when there's a kind of temporary suspension of the trial. It's like, we haven't resolved it, but we can move on with this, like a metaphor or an image that allows you to do that.
It creates emotional space just to process a little bit.
There you go. It creates emotional space to process. That's a great way to put it.
I want to go back a little bit. We're talking about generational splits on Israel and what it means for American Jews. I guess I'm wondering what you think the future, I know you studied the past and you studied the present. Maybe it's a little bit dangerous to talk about the future because we don't know. But I do wonder what you make of the challenges that are to come for American Jews, especially as more and more younger American Jews on average are more critical of Israel. What do you think that will do to the American Jewish identity? What kind of fissures do you think that will mean? I'm curious what you think American Jewish life will look like, and obviously it's different for a lot of different American Jews, but what it will look like in 10 or 20 or 30 years.
One thing, it's a very tiny group, but I found it to be moving, and it's worth saying because it's also surprising and unexpected. But there were a number of Jewish college students who became very active in the pro-Palestinian movement. They were participating in the encampments and so forth. And all of a sudden, in the encampments, they began to observe Jewish rituals. They began to have a Shabbat dinner, or they held these Passover seders. And it was meaningful to them in ways that it had never been. Some of them maybe had never even participated in these kind of rituals. So that might seem like a paradox, but it was not at all, because they were discovering meaning in this deep, millennia-old religious traditions that were not about Israel and maybe spoke to them, and so that they actually found their way to rituals. So in short, I will say that non-Zionist or anti-Zionist expressions of Judaism will grow, actually, as a result of this. Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, which is probably the most prominent anti-Zionist Jewish organization, has a strong religious dimension to it. So rituals will emerge from this conflict and will change through the conflict. Passover seders are one of the key moments because they're celebrated by, a huge percentage of Jews, and it's the celebration of freedom.
That's really interesting. It seems like what you're saying is that, the American Jews that are more critical of Israel may be becoming more religious or practicing the religion of Judaism, which seems to be different than the American Jews of the 1970s who are maybe critical of Israel, or the late 1960s who were maybe critical of that time, who I believe were more secular. Is that fair?
That's 100% right. The Jews in the New Left tended to be secular. In fact, there are Jews who came up in the New Left, who are now in their 70s or 80s, who are involved in organizations like JVP, who have been very surprised at how religious the younger people are today.
That was producer Sam Corey speaking with Julian Levinson, a professor of American Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan. Coming up, what if Detroit were to increase its population by expanding its borders? We'll talk with a mayoral candidate who hopes to do just that. We'll be right back here on the Metro. Stay with us.